Now, you may notice that inside the handout, every one of these sessions gives you more printed material. And the reason for that is I know how these days go, and as the day goes on, I figure I better give you more stuff in print because I'll become more and more incoherent, less methodical. And besides that, each time I want to, maybe you've noticed this, I'll speak for fewer minutes and give you more time to ask questions and get from me what you want. Because as the day goes on, it's just more and more important, in order to keep your interests actually, is to let you click on me and pull down what you want. But now, let me talk to you about, in some ways, this last session, the title, Preaching to the Emerging Culture, is I don't know. It was a little bit of a hook. It's a little way of trying to get your interest. You heard me make a reference to the fact, it's very ironic. Because we're in Manhattan, we have a young church. It's a young city. And 18 months ago, we did a survey after the worship service, and there was something like, 2/3 of the people stayed after the service and filled it out. And our average age was something like 29. Which means, of course, since over 30 includes 30s, 40s, and 50s, under 30 includes only the 20s, there's an awful lot of 20-somethings in the church. It's more than half. In other words, the number of 20-somethings is the biggest group in the church. So ironically, over the years, I've had people, the last 5 or 6 years, people come to me and say, you're really weird because, I knew that, but I said, in what particular way are you suggesting that I'm weird? Is that you're old, but you've got a young church. Ordinarily, everybody's wrestling to how do we reach the 20-somethings? How do we reach them? They're hard to reach. And almost everybody reaching the 20-somethings are, just a little bit older than 20-somethings, and here you are, this fairly older person, and you got a bunch of 20-somethings. So how are you doing it? Now, on the one hand, I would say, I don't know. I just happen to be preaching the gospel in a city where there's a lot of younger people, so they come. But as I've reflected on it, I think there are some things we're probably doing right. And so I'm only going to tell you what some of those things might be. I'm not trying to say, here's how you can reach the emerging church. I don't know. I don't have a goatee, for example. And I don't know if that's requisite or not. I really don't. I'm really not here to tell you something plus or minus about the emerging church. I'm actually here to give you some ideas on what I have seen about reaching out to people who are young. How you preach the gospel to them, how you reach them, how you lead them to faith. Here are a few ideas. And when I say this will be the shortest of the presentation, so that you can ask me more questions about this subject or any other subject. Also, notice I've put I've just thrown a lot more stuff in here that I think on apologetics, on evangelism, to younger people, to contemporary people. You can read this. I'm sure you'll go away saying, good, I got something to read, even though I'm not sure that I certainly couldn't cover it all in this session, and I think every session should be shorter in my presentation, longer in the Q&A. But if you turn to page 27, I would like to make an observation about how... And when I'm done with, by the way, when I'm done with this little section, some of you are going to say, well, I don't hear. Some of you are going to say, well, there really isn't anything I can do then, is there? But don't you want to have somebody tell you that? It takes the pressure off. Right now, when you read material on reaching people today, there's consensus, which I agree with, that that the generations are different in the way in which they think, in the way in which they, in their worldview. So people of my generation, I'm 55, people of my generation are often called moderns. And people of my kids' generation are often called postmoderns. My parents say, what the heck does that make us? I don't really know, because they thought they were modern too. But there's no doubt that the difference between, and by the way, somebody once told me, a missionary once told me, they would say the change between my parents, who were in their 80s, me, I'm in the 50s, my kids who were in their 20s, and the change that we're experiencing in our culture has been accelerated in other parts of the world, where the people our age are more as traditional as my parents, but the kids who are suddenly being immersed in a global American kind of popular culture are just like the kids here. So I've been told, for example, in Mexico, you have children who are pretty much like your children, but parents who are as maybe conservative as your great-grandparents were. So if you can imagine, those of you who are my age, if you can imagine your parents raising your children, you know how they would have probably killed each other by now, right? That's what you have in the rest of the world. There is a change going on. And here's what most people, and I agree with this, by the way, most people would say, moderns are more rational and cognitive. Postmoderns are more experiential and intuitive. So moderns tend to be able to follow along, syllogisms, this, therefore this, sort of long lines of logical reasoning. And postmoderns tend to have their eyes glazed over. That's probably true to some degree. Secondly, moderns tend to be secular. They tend to be anti-supernatural. Postmoderns are more open to the spiritual and the mystical. I think I can attest to that too. I remember in the early 90s, in the 80s, and even in the 70s, even when I wasn't in New York City, I very often found that the biggest issue that people had with Christianity was miracles. They just could not handle miracles. And I still, even up until recently, I had a Bible study for older men. I mean, my church is so young that at one point I realized that I had to have a Bible study for men over 45 because there was nobody over 45 in my church, and so I huddled them together for warmth. And I remember even some of them would bring non-Christian friends, and older white men in New York City, their biggest struggles who weren't Christians is they can't handle miracles. They can't handle the resurrection. They can't handle the idea of divine revelation. They just can't handle miracles. But I remember in the mid-'90s, back when we used to have a question and answer after every service. I would preach the sermon, and then I would say, as soon as the postlude is over, I'll meet anybody down front who wants to have a question and answer time, and we'd have 45 minutes of questions and answers on the sermon or on anything that anybody wanted to ask about. They were extremely valuable. I had to get rid of them when I started going to 3 and 4 services, unfortunately. But what I actually said in the sermon, it was a sermon on Jesus and the feeding of the 5,000. And I remember saying, now look, some of you may just say, this couldn't have happened because it's a miracle and these things don't happen. And I said, I would like you to, I'm going to preach the sermon without reference to that. I'm just going to assume miracles are possible. And I'm sorry to leave some of you out, but I'm just going to do that. But if you have any questions, anybody that has questions about miracles, anybody here who has difficulty believing in miracles or difficulty believing this could have ever happened, right after the service, I'm ready for you. I'll answer your questions. I've got some presentation. I got some give and take. I've got some things to tell you about, and I really want to see you right after the service. And after the service, 200 people came. It's a big church. 200 people came. Not a single person there said that and there were a number of people who weren't Christians. Not a single person there said this couldn't have happened. They just didn't. They didn't. They didn't have a problem with it. I mean, it wasn't. Maybe the feeding of the 5,000 isn't quite the same thing as a limb growing back. I mean, in some ways, there are miracles and there's miracles, so maybe it wasn't all that audacious a thing. But it really did strike me that, generally speaking, the non-Christians who were younger, even by the middle of the 90s, their struggles with Christianity had much more to do with Christianity being exclusive, with Jesus being the only way, to the idea that Christianity doesn't accept homosexuals, a far more struggle than the idea that the resurrection couldn't have happened. There is some kind of change that happened. That was a change. I recognize that. So moderns are rational, cognitive. Postmoderns are more experiential, intuitive. Moderns tend to be secular, anti-spiritual. Postmoderns more open to the spiritual and the mystical, supernatural. Moderns are more hard liberal or hard conservative, and postmoderns tend to be less ideological. They tend to be less, not across the board, but they are more cynical about the red state, blue state thing. They're more, they don't like the hard left and the hard right at all. And they're just more fuzzy. And then last of all, moderns are individualistic. Postmoderns are more oriented to community and friendship. That's what they say. I think that people are as radically individualistic now as they've ever been. But ostensibly, the younger folks do crave community, and they do crave friendship quite a lot. And one of the, there's an awful lot of articles being written right now in magazines like Fast Company and a lot of articles about how baby boomer managers are just pulling their hair out, notice, over the 20-something and 30s, the 20-something that they're trying to manage. And we're talking not about the church, we're talking about the workplace. And what they're saying is the baby boomers people say, every 6 months or a year, we'll give you feedback about how you're doing. And I read one article just a month ago that said that 20-somethings want feedback every day. They want lots of interaction. They want lots of discussion. They do not like the hierarchy. They want to come right in and talk to you, and they want to tell you what they think. And if you've read some of those articles, there's no doubt about that. But postmodern, I do think that younger people are just as individualistic, but in a different way. They without a doubt, they want conversation, they want interaction, they want to do things together, and they just, I don't think they're going to produce the Marlboro Man that the baby boomers have produced. I know I'm the leader. Follow me. Let's go. Let's do this. Now, these are all true, and if that's true, these generalizations are true of baby boomers versus moderns and postmoderns. But here's where being in a city makes me wonder about overdoing these generalizations. These generalizations are largely true amongst Anglos, who write the books for Zondervan and Erdmans and Baker, and that's the books we're reading, right? And Anglos went through a period in which our culture was almost worshipped science and worshipped rationality and the absolute freedom of the individual. And now there's a backlash. But one of the things, and the idea of there's a strong reaction against objective truth, and there's a strong reaction against rationality and propositions. But when you're in a city, I begin to realize that African Americans, that Latinos, that Asians didn't really ever go through the Enlightenment quite the same way that the Anglos did. And therefore, certainly the people who live in Africa, Latin America, Asia did not. And even though they are moving on into a contemporary postmodern world, they are not as allergic to. I very often find younger evangelicals in this country, white people particularly, they're allergic to fixed doctrine. They're allergic to persuasion evangelism. They're allergic to setting boundaries. They're allergic to talking about truth, and they want everything to be kind of fuzzy, and they want everything to be kind of relational. But when you go to Africa, you go to Latin America, you go to Asia, and you look at the Christianity that's growing there, growing quite a lot, it's not the same at all. It's not at all fuzzy. It's pretty experience-oriented. In that sense, it seems more like postmodern than modern Christianity. But on the other hand, it's quite willing to set boundaries up. And so I realize that in the cities, of course, with African Americans and Latin Americans and Asian Americans, they're not the same as Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and yet they're not the same as Anglos either. And so when I start to read all these books about reaching the emerging church and reaching postmodern, you can't reach postmoderns the way we can moderns, and the purpose-driven church and Bill Hybels and Rick Warren and Saddleback, and that's all modern. We need the postmodern. It just seems to me a very parochial discussion of suburban white people and their children. When I go into the city, it's just not that simple. It just isn't that simple. Not only that, not only do I find that African Americans, Latin Americans, and Asian Americans don't quite fit into that pattern as much. There's no doubt that African American, Latin American, Asian American parents tend to be more collectivistic and more family-oriented, and the children tend to be more want some individual freedom, and they want to make their own decisions. That's not the same. That's not the same difference between my parents and me, or between my children and myself. It's so I'm afraid if we just walk on out there with a template, this is how you reach postmodern people. The average book I pick up reading, here's how you reach the postmodern emerging generation, I think is way too simplistic, and I don't think it works in cities very well. And I'm afraid it's going to be obsolete pretty quickly, especially as America becomes less and less white and becomes more and more multi-ethnic. Continue. Next bullet point. The other thing is, I worry about using the word postmodern very much anymore. Because in the academic world, postmodernism is really kind of passé. In fact, I was a little surprised. Did you know in 1997, there was a huge conference held at the University of Chicago by a lot of academics. 1997, by the way, almost 10 years ago, called After Postmodernism. And here was the question. In fact, you can still find the website. It still talks about it. It says, if we absorb postmodernism, but we do not want to stop in arbitrariness, relativism, or aphoria, what comes after postmodernism? Well, I think the big answer is, first of all, we have to figure out what the heck aphoria means, and then we'll be able to move ahead. But no, what it was saying was 10 years ago, the academics, and these are secular academics, realized that the complete relativism and the statements that all truth is relative and nobody, they realized that this isn't going to help any. One of the reasons, by the way, for this is that the secular academic world is liberal, politically. And they realize that if you stop with relativism, aphoria, and arbitrariness, you have no basis for any kind of political program of any sort at all. And so 10 years ago, they realized, you know what, we're going to have to figure out some better way than just deconstructing all truth and everything's relative and everything's a power play. And so years ago, the academic world started looking for something beyond postmodernism. And for evangelicals to start to say, this is a postmodern generation, this is the way it's going to be for the next 200 years, postmodern people don't like truth and they don't like objectivity and they're into experience and they're into feelings and they're into community, and that's how we have to go next. I'm just afraid in another 10 years suddenly we'll be behind the curve again. Last bullet point. The cultural reality in city centers is that all the worldviews, traditional, which is pre-modern, modern, postmodern, and post-postmodern, which I'm sure must be out there. It must be. I just you're always behind the curve. You're always. Whenever you read something in print, it's out of date. If you read, I remember 10 years ago, the Encyclopedia of New York City came out, and everybody was very excited. And it's a great book, by the way. It's a great book. But I looked up Presbyterians, and right away it said Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church is the largest Presbyterian church in New York City. It's not. We are. I'm not saying that to brag at all. Who cares? What percentage of New York is ever going to be Presbyterian? I don't know. But it's not going to be much, And so that's not a bragging point. I just thought it was fascinating that all these scholars were working on this up-to-date encyclopedia of New York City, and when they got it into print, it was already out of date. They didn't know about us. They had no idea who we were because we only been around at 8 years at that time, and we didn't have our own building, and we were growing. But how could they keep up? So anyway, the reason I threw in postmodernism is I'm sure it's really hot and it's really big, and there's all sorts of meetings going on. I just haven't heard about it. But now, when I say traditional, modern, and postmodern, let's take homosexuality for a second, hot button issue. In the traditional worldview, which doesn't exist that much amongst white Americans, but if you are an Asian American and your parents were from Korea or China, or if you're Latin America, your parents are from Latin America, or if you're Caribbean and your parents are from raised in the Caribbean and come here, the traditional view on homosexuality is that it's just awful, it's just terrible, it's obscene, it's perverted, because it's anti-family. The modern view of homosexuality is it's inborn. You can't help it. It's just the way it's in your genetic code. And therefore, it's just like an ethnicity. You have to accept homosexuals just like you have to accept people of different ethnic groups. The postmodern view of homosexuality is that to say homosexuality is inborn and therefore you can't help it is an insult, a terrible insult. In fact, to say it's inborn is to say there's such a thing as essential identity that I have to comply with. Oh no, I create my own identity. I decide who I am. I'm gay because I want to be. That's postmodern homosexuality. Or, as the Village Voice calls it, that's pomo-homo. Okay? So, pomo-homo and mo-homo, okay? And traditional, those are three different worldviews. And they all have very different views of homosexuality, incredibly different. You go into the city, the traditional worldview will be present with first-generation immigrants who have made it professionally in the city center and come to city center churches. In Redeemer, I got plenty of people like this. They speak English with an accent, but they're successful, they're sophisticated, but they've held on to their traditional worldview. They've done well, okay? But they were raised somewhere else besides America. Then secondly, the modern worldview will be especially present with Anglos, middle-aged people, and... Anyway, okay. Modern worldview will be especially present with Anglos, middle-aged people, and with those working more in business and science. They tend to be the more rational types, the cognitive types. Whereas the postmodern worldview will be especially present with younger Anglos and those in the arts, 80% of which are Anglo. But artsy people tend to be more postmodern, and no matter how old you are, if you work on Wall Street, there's something about that pushes you toward the modern, pushes you toward goal orientation, and pushes you toward following up and data, you see, and hard data. And if you're moving into the arts, no matter what your age is, it pushes you more toward the postmodern. And then I think the postmodern worldview might be seen in younger non-Anglos and in today's teenagers. Probably if you want to see what's coming next, you ought to go down into the teenagers, and it's probably somewhat different. But now here's the frightening thing. Well, you know what? I might have said this 2 years ago when I was here. Some of you, a surprising number of you, were here 2 years ago. Why you're back, I don't know. When I preach the gospel the way I've been talking about today, it kind of cuts through all the different worldviews. That's the thing I want to say, and here's the reason why. If I say to a traditional person, sin is breaking the law of God, they say, right. If I say to a modern or postmodern person, sin is breaking the law of God, they say, well, who's to say what is right and wrong? So if I say, well, the Bible has to say what's right and wrong. The Bible says, thou shalt not commit adultery. And then the modern person or the postmodern person says, well, what if you love each other? And are you trying to tell me that what about Sophie's Choice? And what about these extreme situations? And so here you are arguing about what is right or wrong. What about if you talk about sin the way we've been talking about today? What if you do the Kierkegaard thing? Kierkegaard, in Sickness Unto Death, defines sin this way. Sin is building your identity on anything besides God. Try that one out. Sin is building your identity on anything but God. Now, what's great about that is it shows that sin is not just breaking the rules. Breaking the rules is sin, but it also gets at the sin under the sin. And the sin under sins always is something besides Jesus Christ is your functional happiness and meaning in life, your functional salvation, whether you call it that or not, right? And so Kierkegaard's in Sickness Unto Death says that sin is building your identity on something besides God. If you build your life on your career instead of God, or if you build your life on your family instead of God, if you build your life on your looks or your status instead of God, it will drive you into the ground because you have to have it. It's an idol, and you'll be inordinately angry if something blocks you from it. You'll be inordinately scared if something is threatening it. You'll be inordinately proud if you achieve it. You'll be inordinately depressed and suicidal if you fail it. And that's the reason why building our identity, anything but God, screws your life up. Of course, lying is also sinful. And adultery is also sinful. But you only lie and commit adultery if, first of all, you commit the sin of idolatry. You'd only lie if you've made something more important than Jesus. Something that you've got to have. You'd only commit adultery if you've made something more important than Jesus. I need affirmation that I don't get from Jesus. So, of course, lying and committing adultery and murder, these things are all wrong. But they all come from the sin under the sin, and the sin under the sin is idolatry. The sin under the sin is making something besides Jesus your functional happiness. It's building your identity on anything but God. Guess what? The postmodern and modern people are quiet when you do that. Because instead of arguing, well, who's to say whether committing adultery is always wrong? Instead, here's what they say. They say, Hadn't thought of it like that. I guess if there is a God, I guess that would be true. But how do I know there is a God? How do I know these things are true? And suddenly, they're asking you the questions. Instead of you trying to say there's an approach to sin and an approach to grace, an approach when you deal with the gospel by talking about the sin underneath the sins. Traditional people understand that. Modern people actually understand that. Postmodern people understand that. What I'm trying to show you when I say distinguish religion from Christianity and irreligion, do the sin underneath the sin, always bring Christ to bear on the heart rather than just simply telling people to try harder. That cuts across the worldviews, and you better have a way of cutting across the worldviews because increasingly you're going to have all those different people in your church. One of the dangers of orienting an entire church toward young, postmodern, artsy, white people and doing everything to the non-cognitive, everything to the experiential, everything to the communal, everything like that, is you may get 500 people there, you might get 1,000 people there, and they're all within the age 21 to 25. Is that a healthy church? I don't know. Is that not just a youth group? Probably. What will happen if you just keep that church together for 20 years? It'll change quite a lot. So I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying I'm not sure that that's the wave of the future. And I have a feeling churches like that are in for a lot of bumps. Okay. Most of the other stuff that's in here has to do with apologetic themes and evangelistic methods that I have found helpful in a place like New York, and therefore I think helpful with secular people today. But I'm not going to go through them unless you ask me a question now, and then I can say, aha, it's right here, and let me show you where that is. So let's take questions about reaching the emerging generation, or anything else we talked about today. Let's go. Yes? Oh, it's the same guy, only you're wearing red now. Hi, guy. It's scarlet, okay.
This morning you spoke positively about N.T. Wright's commentary. You speak positively about on page 24.
Yeah.
As you know, he's a high definition.
Yeah.
Himself.
Mm-hmm.
Some people today think he's the new Moses. Some people think he's the new Judas. I have to appreciate him. I appreciate your positive comments, but I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to share your thoughts about him.
No. Listen, I think he's wrong about justification. I have the traditional Reformed evangelical view of justification. I believe in forensic justification. I believe in imputed righteousness. But apart from that, I think he's terrific. How simple is that? You know what? The reason I am sharing that, I don't find many people who have that view of him. It seems to be all or nothing. And I don't know why. And again, it might be because I'm old enough, and I didn't study him in seminary, and so I didn't get kind of immersed in him or something like that. But he, on the one hand, I think he's a particularly adroit and skillful he's taken stuff that I learned in seminary with Voss, Ritter Voss, redemptive history, biblical theology, creation, fall, redemption, restoration. I mean, you all know, the difference between reading the Bible redemptive historically along the plot line of the Bible. Wright is terrific at that. Incredibly good at that. When he comes to justification, I understand what he's trying to get at. I just think he overreaches. He doesn't do a very good job. His book, Resurrection of the Son of God, is unbelievably good, and one of the best things I've ever read. I read it as I was coming out of off the thyroid cancer. I might have told you this a couple of years ago. When I was getting over I was coming off of the radioactive iodine and all that with thyroid cancer, and so reading a book on the resurrection that good had a huge impact on me. But you know what? I asked John Stott last month what he thought of N.T. Wright, and he says, N.T. Wright gets the cross wrong, but the resurrection right. Which is probably a little more negative than I would be. And I think he was just John Stott, speaking shorthand. Everything is so simple with John Stott. But I think that's basically right. I don't think he says everything N.T. Wright says about the cross is wrong. My goodness, no. But he was after the justification thing, too. So, great. Okay, here I'm on record. Okay, come get me. Back here and then up here. Yes, sir, back there. There's two of you. Either one of you, go ahead.
This morning, after this morning session, of course, we're discussing the 1, 2, 3, 4 and all. What do you think about those who start with number 4 and do 1, 2, 3?
Oh, you mean you start with a problem?
Start with a problem, like situations.
Yeah, you mean start with a problem and then come all the way back to it. Well, you know what? In a way, that how do you do introductions? It's not at all a bad. There's nothing wrong with that. What I'm trying to say is it's not at all bad to start in your introduction by posing a human, practical, down-to-earth issue problem, and then leaving that behind, going into the text, and then coming back to it. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Not only in a way, when I was in my church in Virginia, and there's the same people who'd been there for 30 years, and it grew very slowly, but these are stalwarts, and they were faithful members of the church all their lives. Their parents, their grandparents were all in the church. You know what your introduction could be? Because your introduction is telling people why they should sit there for the rest of the sermon. That's the purpose of the introduction, is to convince people to stay there for the rest of the sermon. And for them, all I had to do was to say, last week we got to verse 10. And this week we're going to start with verse 11. And that was all they needed. Because they're there because they're faithful and because you're my pastor. And it's a whole... In a place like New York, I have to start off by saying there's an issue and there's a problem and we don't know what to do about it, but there's a lot in this text that will help us unravel it. And people go, oh, yeah, I've always wondered about that. So that is actually fine. So it's really 4, 1, 2, yeah. You start with 4 and get back to 4. That's fine. See? Yes, behind you. Go ahead, sorry. A blog exchange. Which one? Oh yeah, they were unhappy because I endorsed a book that they thought was a bad book. Yeah? What about it? Oh, on blogging. Well, I think that's the limitations. I mean, when you talk to somebody on the phone or in person, there's context. Even on the phone, you can tell all sorts of things about a person on the phone. Online, you don't know who you're talking to at all. There's no context. It's just total decontextualized content. And I don't think that's very good. I think it's very difficult to know who I'm talking to. I think tones of voice are very hard to control. I think on the phone, you can control your tone of voice. You can let people know what you're. I also think blogging makes it very easy to very quickly write off something without thinking about it. Whereas you say, well, what about letter writing? Well, letter writing, you had to think. You spent time on it. I have a number of friends of mine who will not do weblogs or talk on weblogs because they say, I just know that when I just shoot something back and then it's out there for everybody to see forever, I always am sorry. I wish I had spent another half hour thinking about it. So I think it's very, very limited. I think if you have people who already know each other and you want to enhance the relationship. So if you have people who get together twice a year or 4 times a year or regularly and you want to enhance the relationship so that you have a place where you're emailing each other regularly every day, that could be incredibly good. But when it comes to trying to develop relationships with people that you don't know, I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, what the problem was in many ways is these women don't know me at all, or they wouldn't say what they said. So I tried my best to, you saw it obviously. I said, maybe your attitude and all that isn't the best, and then they got even more angry. And actually, I remember talking to a couple of people saying, this just doesn't really work. I mean, there's just no way to talk this way. If I got them on the phone, it would be different. If I could sit down in a conversation, but you can't. It just doesn't. It's just it's too decontextualized. So, oh well, it wasn't a bad experience for anybody, including them. I don't think. Almost a little bit of a comedy, but anyway. Go Yes, over here and then here. Go here first. Go ahead.
You said aspects of Buddhism, modern kind of gone by. I think a big part of it is authenticity and genuineness within the church. That's a large part of the religion.
Right.
Church. Do you think that is a passing thing also within the church? You see a lot of churches going more self-move or small movement. Is that something?
What do you think authenticity means? When people say, we don't like the plastic and the polished and the put on, we like authentic. What do you think that means?
I think relationship. I think also Christianity, authentic faith being acted out. I think that being more authentic rather than just a Sunday experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think authenticity is a big word.
It is. It is.
Genuineness is big. So that's something I think people are trying to replicate in churches. Is that just something you think is going to pass?
Well, no, I wouldn't say it's going to pass, but I can say something a little bit. I think I can also diffuse it a little bit. I remember very clearly when John Stott, my old hero, who I still know a little bit, I remember when he was here preaching, and I remember the first year I was in Virginia, I went down to Virginia Beach to hear him preach. This is 1975. And what he said was, the younger generation, that was me at the time, the younger generation is tired of inauthentic church and wants authenticity, and will not be happy with anything but authenticity. And that was our battle cry too. And now, of course, people younger are looking at us saying, we want something more authentic than you. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, that's what we said about the people older than us. And now that I think about it, I don't really know what the heck I exactly meant when I said it. I think authenticity meant transparency, not a lot of spin, be honest, not press releases. I think what happens is as you get older and you get more power and more money, there's a tendency to control communication because you can. And you can have spokespersons, and you can. You're also more put upon. You're also more kind of assaulted by people, and so then you become more studied, more formal, less spontaneous, and therefore maybe less authentic. And therefore, it could be that the younger generation always doesn't want to work through middlemen, or doesn't want to work through your people. We'll call my people because they don't have any people. They're their own people. So I wonder whether, when you say it'll be a passing thing, I wonder whether it won't play out in a particular way, and then 30 years from now, the next generation will look at this generation and say the very, very same thing. So I'm a little cynical about it, but not much. I think it's a great call to reformation, and it's a great way to make us look at ourselves and clean house. Whenever a younger generation comes along and says, a lot of this is put on, and it's not authentic, and it's not real. But there's a little bit of arrogance in that. There's always a little bit of youthful arrogance in that, because when you really push down on what authentic means, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the word is a little bit filled. It's filled with a certain amount of just visceral feelings about certain things that will change as you get older, but I don't know. So answer it, no, it will never go away. It's just it's going to morph into something else. Oh, wait a minute. Over here. Yes, you've been waiting.
The gist of your talk right now is preaching to the emergent culture, and I appreciate that. My question is, how would you bring across a text, say one of the imprecatory Psalms, Psalm 83 or Psalm 94, which quite openly mock the unbelief of the wicked?
Mm-hmm.
How do you bring that across in your context without sounding unsophisticated or narrow-minded?
Well, the imprecatory Psalms, and first of all, who knows where to put the accent? Is it imprecatory, or that's the first big issue. One of the issues is we don't want to preach about it because we're afraid we'll mispronounce it. But the gospel can get rid of that self-consciousness. No. I think, Derek, listen, this is where the redemptive historical preaching really helps terrifically. You can't preach those Psalms without bringing you to... Take Tremper Longman, a friend of mine, Old Testament professor, take his 1 or 2 books on the divine warrior, in which he says that in the Old Testament, there is all kinds of talk about warfare, spiritual warfare, that God is a warrior and he's going to destroy evil, and he's going to come in war against it, and he's going to devastate, he's going to destroy it. And that we are his people, and therefore we also hate the enemies of God, and we hate evil. And so in the Old Testament, there's a great deal of talk like that, and what Tremper will say is that when Christ comes, everybody expects him as the Messiah to take up the sword, because the Messiah is supposed to be the divine warrior. But to everybody's shock, Jesus Christ goes to the cross. And yet, I remember Tremper says, and I'm probably going to refer to this when I get there in the book of Mark. He says, a centurion, isn't it? Isn't it the centurion at the very end of the book of Mark says, truly this was the Son of God? And Tremper says, this is a man of war who realizes he's looking at the death of a warrior. He knows a soldier when he sees one. And that what Jesus Christ is doing is he's defeating death, not the way anybody thinks. He is defeating death by forgiving us. He's defeating death and defeating evil by not by bearing the sword, but not by using the sword, but by receiving the judgment in himself. So he comes not with a sword in his hands, but nail in his hands. I think Ed Clowney used to say he comes not to bring judgment, but to bear judgment. And this changes the way in which we battle evil now. Because Paul says in Romans 12, you don't repay evil for evil, but overcome evil with good. Where did that come from? That's not in the Psalms. It's because Jesus Christ has forever fulfilled and changed the way in which the divine warrior battles against evil. And actually, I made a reference to that when I was talking about the demoniac. Jesus defeats evil by exchanging places with us and receiving it in himself. And I think N.T. Wright is right when he says, if you don't recognize how Jesus defeats evil, and you just pick up the Old Testament, you go back to the Old Testament and ignore the change that Jesus has brought in the New Testament time, a new stage in redemptive history, how he's transformed, just like he's transformed the tabernacle and the animal sacrifices, that they're fulfilled in him, and the clean laws are fulfilled in him, so is divine warfare. And if that's the case, then the Psalms, the sort of hopeless and angry Psalms, are Derek Kidner, actually, in his little commentary on the Psalms, is very good about saying that Jesus Christ has forever changed what divine warfare means. And Paul shows us what it means. And we have a hymn about it, by the way. You know what the hymn is? Let's see. For not with swords loud clashing, nor roll of stirring drums, with deeds of love and mercy the heavenly kingdom comes. So the divine warfare has changed. That's how you do it. And people really like it when you talk about it like that. So it just means you have to put the psalm into the grand scheme of redemptive history. And boy, that's one of those places where I know there's brothers and sisters who teach Old Testament evangelicals around the country, and I guess others too, who say you can't preach Christ from the Old Testament because the original author did not have Christ in mind, and you just can't do that. You can't impose Christ on those texts. You have to just look at the text and it's in that historical context and preach it that way. I don't know what you're going to do with those Psalms. You can't do it. You mustn't do it. So, anyway, answer your question? Yes, over here. Go ahead, Genevieve.
Another topic is preaching to American culture.
Sure. You can go on another topic.
Well, I was just interested more on the effects of the emerging culture, because you've been in sermon a while back. You gave an example about a man who was working with someone who underused him, and he basically messed him up and covered for her.
Isn't that a great story?
Great,
True story.
great story. And you'll probably want to briefly.
We have to now, otherwise it's just between you and me. Should we let them in on it? Go ahead. Well, anyway, what's your question now about?
Well, you'll probably butcher it, so I want you
Okay.
to tell the story. But if you hear, I'm just more interested in, you hear more stories like that now. What kind of, what's the ripple effect that you're seeing?
I mean, what effect is the preaching having on? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that story, I think, it illustrates so
It does.
the kind of effect that can have in the secular workplace, the kind of effect that faith can have.
Can you summarize the question?
Yeah, well, the question is the preaching I'm doing. Are you seeing people actually changing, or are they actually living different lives on the basis of the preaching? Well, the story. I mean, I'll tell you two or three stories that I use to try to get across to younger professionals that they have to bring their gospel values into the way in which they work. They can't. Our culture right now insists that you leave your faith in the private world, and that when you come out into the public world, you seal your faith off from the way in which you work. And it has nothing to do with in here. That's for your private life. And what Genevieve is trying to say is that we try to push the fact that you can't do that. You've got to bring your gospel. The gospel has to affect every part of your life, including your work. The one story you've heard, maybe another story you haven't heard. One story I use in order to get that across, and this is true. I talked to a woman after service a good 10 years ago who almost sure worked for ABC. She worked for one of the networks. And she told me that she wasn't a Christian, but she was trying Redeemer out. I don't know whether she ever became a Christian or where she is now, because I only talked to her once. But she said the reason she was coming to Redeemer was because a few weeks before, she had made a mistake. It should have cost her her job, but her boss took the heat for her and basically went in and said it was his fault. And because her boss was incredibly well thought of, he had the capital to be able to handle that. So he lost some face, but it wasn't fatal, and he could get it back. Whereas if she had been blamed for it, she would have lost her job. So she went into him and said, "Look, I've had a lot of bosses take credit for things I've done. I've never had a boss take the blame for something I've done. And I really want you to know how much this means to me." And he says, "Don't even think about it." She said, "Well, but I've never met anybody who did this before, so why do you do that? Or why would you do that?" And he said, "Don't even think about it." Finally, she pushed him and said, "Okay, let me just tell you this. I'm a Christian. And Jesus took the blame for me. I mean, that's the theme of my whole life. And so it seemed to me that in this case, I certainly could take some blame for you, because it wasn't going to cost me my job. It was going to cost me something, but not that much. So in just a small way, I thought I would take the blame for you." And the principle there is, if you're a Christian leader, you must, I don't think I said it that day, you must take pain, bear pain, but not inflict it. A real leader bears the pain rather than inflicting it. So, for example, it's typical in the management world. If you're going to lay somebody off, you're just not, the day they have to clean out their desk, you just go on a trip or something, or you come in late. You just don't want to face their pain. Right? But a Christian manager should. A Christian manager should be there, should explain, maybe do what they can to be sympathetic. In other words, you should be willing to bear the pain rather than inflict pain. You should be willing to bear the blame in some cases rather than take the credit for what the people do underneath you. You should give them the credit but bear the blame. That's all very Christian. And that has no reference to sharing your faith, but it means you're working your gospel values in. I'll give you another example that what Genevieve is saying, I'm trying to lift some of these examples up, and I have so few of them, to give younger people the inspiration to get creative about how do you live like a Christian in the workplace without waving your Bible at people. In other words, how do you actually work it into, not use your job as a way to share your faith, though that's fine too, but use your job to actually embody your faith, the way you work. Embody your faith distinctively. A second example, a man who owned a whole set of car dealerships in North Carolina, who was a Christian believer, at one point discovered that, you know how most car dealerships, the salesmen have the right to negotiate the price. And so there's a limit, but they can, people can come in and negotiate the price, and the salesman has the ability to knock some off or not. And they did a study, and they were absolutely convinced by the study that basically men got better deals than women, and white people got better deals than non-white. Because women and non-white people tended not to push. They weren't as aggressive. They weren't as well informed in many cases, and they just gave up the negotiations faster. And they realized that what they were really doing was that basically the white men were getting great deals, and everybody else was subsidizing their deals. And they realized that just was unjust. So this guy got together and with his management people, and he says, look, I'm doing this because I'm a Christian, but I would hope all of you would just have just a general sense of justice. Is that we have to sacrifice in order to fulfill justice, which of course is what Jesus did. He said, we have got to stop doing this. We're going to have to just set set the price and stick with it. And that's the only way we're going to do justice. Especially older black women are just not making. They're getting screwed. And what was interesting was everyone he told me that when that happened, their profits went down a good 10%. Now you realize that is huge. That's huge. And immediately, all the employees got together. They knew what they were doing and why, because the management explained it. One of the things he said they did was they got more efficient. They got together and they said, in order to make up for this 10% difference, is there some ways we can do things better? And so it actually created better business practices, and they knocked it down to 5%. But when it was all done, they were just making a lot of money less. And he got everybody together and he said, if we go back to the old way, our profits will go up, etc. And everybody said, don't do it. The whole labor force loved the fact that they stood up for justice. They were much more loyal to the. They lost a lot of customers, especially, by the way, white men wouldn't come, and non-white people and women started coming because everybody heard about it in the community, and yet, nevertheless. Basically, they make less money, and yet there's less turnover in the labor force. The people are more loyal. They love the jobs. They love the company they're working for. And the CEO is almost sure that he can't quite put he can't quantify it. But what he said is they have actually added value, which is what capitalism is supposed to do. They have pressed a lot of the value out into the community instead of taking it themselves, because people are saving money. But also, almost certainly, he's getting better work out of his employees, who are very proud of the company. And yet, that's Christian, because what he did was they sacrificed for justice. They had a principle of justice, and even the guy was able to say, on the basis of common grace, surely those of you, whether you're Christians or not, recognize what we're doing is the right thing. Genevieve's just trying to say, do you see people really changing? I see people talking about this excitedly, because whereas older people, baby boomers, expect to privatize their faith from their work, younger people don't think that's authentic, by the way. And whenever we talk about we've got to find ways of serving the common good and doing a better job by bringing our Christian values into our work, but not by beating people over the head with the gospel, I mean, to say you've got to become a Christian, but embodying the gospel, embodying the servant heart of the gospel, embodying the justice of the gospel, embodying all these things, younger people get incredibly excited. Whether they're doing it or not, I don't know. They want to. We're having conferences and we're having conversations about doing it. I'm almost sure it will bear fruit. And there are some stories that are starting to pop up, but not many yet. But that's all part of, I think, working with an emerging culture. Okay, we got some more time for some more questions. Any other hands? Because I'm going to let you go in about 5 minutes. Go ahead, yes. How long is a what? Oh, I have no idea. Are you asking how long my sermons are? How long is a good sermon? That really depends. Surely that depends. How long are my sermons? 35 minutes. But you know what? That's pretty long. I think one of the reasons I'm able to sustain the 35 minutes is because I'm better than I was 20 years ago. I think 20 years ago, 35 minutes, and sometimes I did go 35 minutes. I wasn't. I think I was self-indulgent. So I would say aim for a 30-minute sermon, but who knows? I mean, your services are different and people's attention spans are different. So I don't know. Yes, okay.
Suppose you're preaching on a text from the gospel, and your 1, 2, 4, 3 model says you can save that for the punchline. But the punchline is the text.
Mm-hmm.
So then what do you do with your plot?
The punchline is the text?
The punchline becomes the text because it's Jesus' life living out and doing what we can't do.
Well, it may be late. I am older than I used to be. You know, For example, do you mean, when I gave you the one example I gave you of the way N.T. Wright, which I followed, read the demoniac, the punchline was to run to the end of the book of Mark and say at the end of Mark, Jesus exchanges places. He's stripped naked. He's crying out. He's in the tombs. That waits to the end. And see, even in the book of Mark, I go to the end of the book of Mark. Just like if I'm preaching on Abraham in Genesis 18, I go to the end of the Bible. I go to the ultimate priest. And that's my punchline. So
I guess you're only stuck on Easter.
yeah, because I'm already at the end. Yeah. No, even Easter, I'm trying to think, what do you do on Easter? It depends. For example, you could preach on the resurrection of the there are several resurrections in the Old Testament. Elijah and Elisha do resurrections. And if you wanted to, you could do a resurrection and then get to Jesus that way. But when you're trying to get the gist of something, it's a good idea to do it deliberately and methodically, and try to 1-2. But eventually you get free to do it all. You get the gist of it, you get the hang of it, and then you do riffs and you do variations. And I certainly don't want you to think that every single time you have to do it exactly that way. Okay, time for one more, I think. Yeah, sure, Dick. Okay, I'll do two, because you're so nice and you're next to each other. Go ahead, Dick.
You made the point that addressing contemporary culture is a multitude of subcultures that we face, traditional, modern, postmodern. And yet, if you look at the church today in general, across all of these, it's having trouble having a significant influence. Is there one overarching corrosive influence that as you think in preparing sermons and communicating is one of the big barriers?
Are you saying that the church is having trouble having an influence on who, though?
On broader culture.
On broader culture.
Yeah. As you're looking at this and preaching, do you see one that cuts across these?
Well, now the reason for that, I think, is what maybe Genevieve was getting at, or what I was trying to say when I answered her question. I think that a few years ago, we came to realize that, and Dick, you know about this, is that culture is not going to only change through evangelism and church growth. Because if people continue to seal off their faith from the way they work, then you can really have a lot of Christians who aren't influencing the culture at all. Now Peter Berger, I think, made some crack about the fact that most of the country is as religious as India, but that the people who actually live in, the people who run the major institutions, the networks, are as secular as the Swedes. And so he says, what you have with America is you have a country of Indians ruled by Swedes. And actually, it's true that 80% of the people in the country could be against same-sex marriage, but if the New York Times and if Hollywood and if Harvard, Yale, and Princeton are all for it, it's going to come. And so what you have is you have Christians who are sealing their faith off from their work, and you also have Christians who just simply aren't penetrating into the cultural centers. They're just not there. They're just not. You don't have 2 or 3 Christian Steven Spielbergs. You don't have Christians at the top of the Rockefeller Foundation. You're just not there. So I think the way you change culture is by giving not just people a vision for church leadership. So to say, you got to go into the ministry and you got to preach the word and you've got to go into the mission field. The 98% of the people who aren't going to be ministers, they have to have a vision for being cultural leaders as Christians. And I'll tell you, as a pastor, I wasn't trained. No offense. I love Gordon-Conwell. I wasn't trained to do that. I don't know how to do that. I had an actor come into me in the earliest days. Actor come in to see me. He became a Christian. He was on the soaps. And he says, I've become a Christian Redeemer. I'm really excited, but I want you to help me understand what it means to be a Christian actor. And I said, okay, what do you mean? And he says, well, for example, and he gave me 3 or 4 different roles. And he says, could I have that role as a Christian? Could I do this role as a Christian? And I didn't even know. I said, well, I don't know. That doesn't sound good. Well, that doesn't sound so bad. But it was all my gut. I was just out of my gut here. And then he says, what do you think of method acting? I said, what is method acting? And he says, well, in method acting, what they teach you is not to act angry. If the part calls for anger, not to act angry, but get angry. You get angry. You think of things that have made you angry in the past, and you get angry. And I said, I don't know. That doesn't sound very good, but I didn't know, because I knew how to help him be a Christian on the weekends and in the evenings. I knew how to tell him how to come into the Bible study. I'll teach you how to run a Bible study and how to evangelize and how to share your faith. But I had no idea how to help him integrate his faith with his work. And since 98% of the people spend 80% of their time, and 98% of the Christians are spending 80% of their time working, we're giving them almost no help as a church. And that is an enormous area. And the church has got to learn how to develop tracks both for church leadership and cultural leadership. In the church, I was only trained on how to get lay people more and more into my church and out of their field. So they're more active in the church, and they're leading Bible studies, and they're serving on the board, and they're moving on up. I do not know anything about how to help them flesh out their Christianity in their job, and yet that's really what will change the culture. So it's a big one. Okay, yes, this is it.
My question ties into the imprecatory songs. Now,
Are you sure it's imprecatory? Okay, I'm sorry.
well, we come to Christ on the cross, and then Christ is going to come again, and he is going to destroy
Yeah.
all his enemies. And I was just wondering how you preach on the second coming.
Oh, yeah, and hell. Well, guess what? You're in luck. There is something in there in the handout. Well, listen, when it comes to that, now that's a big issue. Let's just end with this one, because this is a big apologetic issue. Instead of younger people coming and saying, I can't believe in miracles, that isn't their problem. They are really bothered by the idea of hell. They're really bothered. And the idea of judgment, and the idea that, on Judgment Day, at the end, that God is going to punish evildoers or send them to hell for their wrong choices. The two things you might want to find in there, Miroslav Volf has an incredibly good little apologetic piece. In fact, you know what? Let me read it to you. Can I just read it to you? I know we're not supposed to have you leave till 4, but I'm going to get you out of here in 1 minute. But it's on page... Whoops, it must be on page 32. Yes, it is. Bottom of page 32. Tell me, this is a terrific piece of how do I say it? This is taking a postmodern... In here, I try to talk about entering a worldview and yet challenging it. If you're doing explosive, if you're trying to put explosives into a rock so that when you detonate the device, the rock will be destroyed. You can't put the detonation device. You can't put the explosive right on the face of the rock. It'll just shear off the rock. It won't destroy. You have to burrow down into the rock and then explode the material, and then it gets rid of the rock. Okay. So in the same way, you can't just assault a worldview and say, wrong, it's all wrong. What you have to do is you have to find the overlap between what the Bible says and the worldview and agree with it and go into it and sometimes express it to the person who you're talking to as well, if not better than they can, and then challenge it from the inside of it. Now, here, let me show you how Miroslav Volf does this. Look at this. He says, my thesis is that the practice of nonviolence requires a belief in divine vengeance. You see right away what's happening there? My thesis is the practice of nonviolence requires a belief in divine vengeance. My thesis will be unpopular with many in the West. Don't forget, Volf is Croatian, and so he knows kind of firsthand what happened there. He says, my thesis will be unpopular with many in the West, but imagine speaking to people, as I have, whose cities and villages have been first plundered, then burned and leveled to the ground, whose daughters and sisters have been raped, whose fathers and brothers have had their throats slit. Your point to them, we should not retaliate? Why not? Why not? Why not be violent? He says, I say the only means of prohibiting violence by us is to insist that violence is only legitimate when it comes from God. Violence thrives today, secretly nourished by the belief that God refuses to take the sword. It takes the quiet of a suburb for the birth of the thesis that human nonviolence is the result of a God who refuses to judge. In a scorched land, soaked in the blood of the innocent, the idea will invariably die like other pleasant captivities of the liberal mind. If God were not angry at injustice and deception and did not make a final end to violence, that God would not be worthy of our worship. Now, do you know what he just did? He says, if I don't know that someday there's going to be divine judgment, I'm going to pick up the sword and I'm just going to smite them. There is no good reason for me not to. If you tell me they came in and they raped, they murdered, they plundered, and you're telling me there's no reckoning, there is no judgment day, this will never be done. Okay, give me my sword. I'm going to go again. And if you say, belief in a God of judgment only leads to violence, you have never experienced violence. That's what he's saying. You don't talk to me. It's really powerful. You've had an easy life, he says, if you think that. He says the reason, and he's basically a pacifist, as maybe you know. He says the reason I can be a pacifist is I believe in Judgment Day. Now, when I've preached on that you can just see people squirm because it enters the worldview, which is nonviolence. Let's not be violent. And then it says if you really knew violence, you have to have something much more powerful than a kind of general secular humanist pacifism to refrain. You're going to be sucked right in unless you have something really powerful. And the only thing powerful enough is to know that someday God's going to make everything right. There'll be a judgment day. Now, the stuff on hell is a little different, but I take C.S. Lewis's approach. And C.S. Lewis's approach is to say that hell, nobody goes to hell who doesn't want to be there. And see, that's pro-choice. And what that does is it enters the worldview and yet deconstructs it. And that's the way you deal with it. That's the way you're persuasive, I think. Okay, I need to close in prayer. Is there any final? David? Is this it? Let me close in prayer. Our Father, who is sufficient for these things? I know that because I'm up here, because I've got the microphone. Because I've done all the preparation, it sure sounds like I am, but I'm not. We really have just scratched the surface of these subjects. We really need your help. We are not, the church is not in a position of strength in this country. We pray that you would revive us, that you would renew us, that you would make us, you would encourage us by our time together today. You'll continue to work in New England, through the ministry of this seminary and of the Ockenga Institute. You'll continue to work through the men and women in this room, and that you'll get glory for yourself that way. And so we do ask that you strengthen us and encourage us and equip us and send us out in the name of your Son, Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen. Okay.